With more cities pushing for sustainable and active travel, and then I'm going to mash it together and say, and with more cities looking at mobility as a service, do we need to maintain the same levels of motor tax, and how does it affect the income from motor traffic? How are those two things, sustainable and active transport and mobility as a service, likely to impact the incomes?
One of the big problems I can see with, if MASK works out, which I think is a really, really good idea, but if it works out and we see vehicle utilization going up and possibly the number of vehicles owned by people going down, that's going to be reduced revenues but increased congestion, if that makes sense. And so I think it's really important to tax not so much the vehicles or the emissions, but how many miles are being done, if that makes sense. It kind of feels like I'm banging on about the same point, but we can't rely anymore on kind of low levels of utilization, because at the end of the day, that traffic will still need the infrastructure, the roads to drive on. And the second point I want to make is that roads, they're used for all of us pedestrians when we go about. It's not just the actual carriageway; it's also the footway. And for cyclists, potholes are way worse than for cars, because there's been countless of times where I almost, fell off my bike because of a pothole. So the quality of the road and the highway is critical for all modes of transport, virtually, except for rail. But you need to get to the train station, so.
We have a growing obesity crisis in this country. I think by 2040 we're going to have unprecedented levels of obesity, and I think anything that encourages people to use bikes, to start walking, to really engage in, as the London Mayor calls it, kind of healthy streets, as it were, is to be encouraged. Alongside that, the epic air quality issue that we have in this country. So I think, there's absolutely some challenges around tax and revenues and where they come from, and electric vehicles, only getting 5% tax off of electricity. But I think at the same time, we have to balance that with the need to really get our nation moving and make sure that we are healthy, because otherwise we've got incredibly huge budget challenges elsewhere within our system, with the NHS, etc.
Eddie Hewitt from Slough Borough Council. I have to admit to a certain amount of dismay for the whole programme today in the kind of focusing on highways and roads. It almost feels like it's CIHET in Highways England. There's been a lot of focus on that, but focus on car travel, road pricing perhaps, highways themselves, the major roads network, and yet we seem to almost have completely ignored transportation and the wider aspects of public transport, active travel, more wider elements of sustainable travel. Is there any reason from you, perhaps as a CIHT, perhaps for not broadening out the agenda a bit more today?
Active modes use the roads as well, so it's not like, when we talk about roads, I think that includes, as a cyclist, I do use the roads, and pedestrians as well. So I'm not sure if that's the case, but I think Andreas.
Okay, it's a fair question. The program does appear to be mostly about highways. In defense, I would say that CIHT is a broad church, as I said in the morning, and we do try and encourage and promote both highways as well as sustainable transport. We have many events and forums where we gone the other way, where it's all about cycling, buses, etc., rather than just highways. Probably today's program, you're right, is more towards highways, but CIHT is quite definitely about the whole spectrum of highways and transport planning.
We saw a recent court case in Birmingham where there was a difficult issue about relational contract between the contractor and the client. I was wondering what the panel feel about long-term relational contracts, whether we've got that right, and how that might change in an era of more risk-based approach and more austerity, I suppose.
Probably referring to is a PFI project in Birmingham, which has gone, I think, all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's been well publicised. It's a PFI, so it's a very complex contractual arrangement when a significant amount of risk is passed onto the SPV and passed down through to the supply chain. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I think it's a good example of how not to contract, because it is incredibly one-sided, it's very onerous, lots of performance specifications, conditions precedent, all the things that lawyers don't like. I think there needs to be a step change and more to the collaborative working approach in contracting, but also more user-friendly contracts. The whole point of the contract is, and you might put it in the drawer once it's signed, but the whole point of a contract is to be used as a project management tool. The contract you're referring to is certainly not that. It's incredibly complex and very hard to follow.
Sometimes we rely too much on the contracts to answer kind of how we're going to deliver some of these schemes. So I don't know anybody here if you're familiar with Project 13 that the ICE and the Infrastructure Clients Group has been moving forward with. And I think what that gives you is a really great framework that is, almost behind a contract, that is about how you work together as an industry to deliver the outcomes required. And it specifically looks at things like the capabilities of the owner, how will digital be managed in this example, the role of the integrator and how you get the outcomes that you require. And I think what we need is more kind of focus on how we structure and set ourselves up and the capabilities required to execute, and then how a contract kind of enables that alongside it.
One of the questions a bit further down, I don't know how tongue-in-cheek this is, but it's basically, will we require qualified lawyers become as commonplace on contracts as QS staff once were? And it partly picks up a question that's just disappeared in here, but it's really about the level of legal skills that we will need to have available to us as an industry as these contracts become potentially more complex, or do you think it's a kind of transition and it's just moving to a new way of working?
Major consultants, major contractors now, and without mentioning any names, do have in-house lawyers within their organisation, and we are certainly seeing that flow down through the size of the organisations. So more and more of our clients do have in-house lawyers in order to review contracts. That said, not everyone does. There's a lot of organisations who don't, but there is definitely a trend of companies bringing in-house expertise. Contracts are becoming more onerous, as I said. Contracts are becoming more complex, and I largely blame the lawyers for that. And so I do think, to directly answer your question, and I'm not just saying this because it keeps me in a job, but I think more legal support is likely to be required over the coming years.
I've just got a slightly contrary view, just in terms of, I'm curious, our industry is ripe for disruption, and we know some of the large technology firms such as Google, Microsoft are targeting 3 specific sectors, and they've said that they're targeting construction, they're targeting legal, and they're targeting health. And these are absolute disruptive forces that are going to come in, and actually, will there be such a thing as a quantity surveyor in 5-10 years' time?
Yeah.
I'm not qualified, even though I've got a law degree, I'm not qualified to comment on the legal profession, but I think we need to be really alive to the level of disruption that's coming down the road, actually.
We're developing, with a university, software to review contracts instead of lawyers reviewing them. And that's already happened in other industries, or is already happening in other industries, the banking sector in particular. That disruption, that change, I think, is going to take place. So whilst I said lawyers are going to be needed more, maybe not when the technology comes and it's ready.
Do you envisage Microsoft and Google being network operators to facilitate future autonomous vehicles? Are we likely to see that level of disruption in our marketplace?
I think it's really hard to read the tea leaves. The pace of change is just increasing rapidly around the world. Kind of 20 years ago, it might have been easy to kind of predict what was going to happen in 5 years' time, but we're seeing a huge level of disruption, and we can't necessarily predict. What I do think is people like that Microsoft and Google, what they love, what they want is the data. Will they want the responsibility of operating the network that goes with that? Will they want to build that capability? Will they see that as part of their business model? I'm not sure. How do we create a positive experience so that road users are happy, I don't know about paying a premium, but are happy to pay for their road usage in a different way? And how do we communicate it? Because communication is such a key to this.
I think it's little things like, filling out direct debit forms for VD and Now it's much better actually, but still, less administration, make it as straightforward as possible and as transparent. Like if you know exactly your driving per mile costs, I don't know, 10 pence, then that makes it easier for you to understand exactly how much a trip costs. And you can go, hang on, you know, I can go to the shop, which is 1 mile away, by car, which costs me, I don't know, £3 or something, or I can just walk, and that's free. So it gives that sense of clarity and transparency. User experience-wise, the other thing is, oh no, escaped my mind. So yeah, but that transparency, I think, is the main thing, really, and less hassle. So that's why we use the existing system.
Obviously, road tax is a Treasury decision, not a Department of Transport one. So should we as a sector be actually lobbying for a change to the way that road duty is collected?
Yes, it is a Treasury decision. And actually one of the things I promised, but I didn't say in the presentation, is that Steve and myself, we went to see some Treasury folks, and they were very receptive to the idea. So that's it. I wish I could say, yep, it's happening in this year, like 2 years from now, but we don't know. It is a political decision more than a Treasury decision. It is up to the Chancellor of the Exchequer to say, we're going to do something about that downward curve. Now, between Steve and myself, Steve puts that somewhere in the mid-2020s. I am young and a bit more optimistic, and I'm sure that as soon as Brexit is sorted, we can do something about it, but we'll see. So, yeah, watch this space.
I'd like to thank our speakers very much for the splendid presentations, and thank you all for your questions as well and the additional discussion we've had. So thanks very much, guys.